Imagine you survived the plague only to be killed by rats. In this video, we'll be looking at the horrific Great Plague of London. So let's get into it. In the early 1600s, Europe was hit with a series of bubonic plagues, which is where one of the most terrifying pandemics in history began. But how did it start? Well, back then, people didn't know that germs caused diseases. They believed it was bad air or an imbalance of the humors, which were thought to be the four substances that make up the body: blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile. This lack of scientific knowledge would cause some very unusual treatments for the illness, such as letting blood through leaching or burning substances like lavender and camphor to purify the air. But what actually caused the plague? It started when rats and fleas infested the clothing of the 10th and 11th century traders in Asia and Africa. When these traders docked in Europe, they brought with them a deadly gift, the Oriental rat flea. These fleas lived on ship rats and were infected with Yersinia pestis, a bacteria which causes plague. The rats would then run away from the ships and spread the disease around the towns and cities. And before long, London was struck with the disease, and it would not be the same ever again. Although it had struck other parts of Europe previously, this time it was much worse than before. To make matters worse, London was extremely overcrowded at the time. People were fleeing religious persecution in other parts of Europe, and so thousands of refugees were pouring into London, putting more strain on the city's resources. On top of this, the hot summers of 1665 and 1666 made conditions ripe for the plague to spread even further. So just how deadly was the plague? It started spreading throughout the summer, and by September 1665, it seemed to have reached its peak. Over 200 prisoners in Newgate, London's central jail, had already died, and a doctor who examined them said there was no cure. All he could do was ease the pain. The death toll continued to rise. In October alone, over 7,000 people died. A month later, that number had doubled. As winter approached, though, the pace of deaths began to slow down. By May 1666, the plague was finally over. In total, it's estimated that 100,000 people lost their lives, which is about a quarter of London's population. Of these 100,000 dead, 50,000 of them were children under the age of 5. One of the worst things about the plague is that it didn't care who it killed. You could be rich or poor, young or old, it didn't matter. It would kill anyone. However, because the poor were living in such cramped conditions, they were more likely to catch the disease and die. Sadly, there was little help for the poor as the rich fled the city. As we mentioned, many people tried to flee London. Those who could afford it left immediately, but most were stuck in the city, and those who were left behind had to endure unimaginable horrors. So what was life like during the plague? When someone was showing symptoms of the plague, their houses were marked with a red cross. If you entered the house, you risked infection and possibly death. These houses were visited by an officer called a parish sexton, whose job it was to collect the dead bodies and bury them. The sexton would go in, carry the body out, and bury it. If they were lucky, they might find another person inside the house who was also infected. Then the sexton would visit that person too. There were also special courts set up to deal with the influx of people dying from the plague. These were called pest houses. These were usually empty buildings, such as barns or sheds, which were used to quarantine people who had contracted the plague. The problem was these sheds weren't always empty. Sometimes there were already people living inside who hadn't yet been infected. Of course, those people soon became infected. And when this happened, the shed would be locked up tighter than ever, and the people inside would face certain death. If you managed to avoid the plague, your problems were far from over, because now you had to live amongst the dead. Streets were littered with the corpses of the plague victims, and these were left there until they could be buried. Even worse, these rotting corpses attracted rats and flies, which spread the disease even further. Things were so bad that mass graves had to be dug to cope with the number of dead bodies. These graves were usually located outside the city walls, such as at the edge of a forest or on a heath. These places were known as pest hills. Bodies were thrown into these holes and covered with the soil. This helped prevent the spread of disease in the city. But it wasn't a nice sight to come across if you went for a walk. It was also common for entire families to be wiped out by the plague. For example, the Howe family, who lived in rural Suffolk, England, had 9 members, and in 1665, 6 of them died from the plague. And now it's time for us to look at some eyewitness testimonies from the time to really get a sense of how scary it was. Robert Hind wrote, "The infection spreading daily more and more. Many of our neighbors and fellow townsmen have been taken away by the physician's warrant to be confined in the pest houses. Others, having died at their own houses, are carried to their graves by the parish officers, who have given warning to the people whose turn it may be next, to prepare themselves for the like fate." He goes on to say that friends of his had lost their children and some had lost their husbands and wives. The terror of it being so great, he says, that nobody will go near them for fear of infection. A doctor named Richard Manningham also wrote about the plague. His account begins with him describing how a friend of his has lost 7 children in 5 days. He then goes on to describe how the plague is spreading. "It came first into the city," he wrote, "and spreads itself by all the avenues and streets into the suburbs and from house to house. There are some whole families taken away in a day. The very physicians and surgeons that visit them are in great peril of their lives." Another man wrote, "We have had an infinite number of burials in the churchyard here. Many of the parishes have been shut up and the inhabitants forbidden to come out on pain of death. We cannot venture abroad ourselves, but by stealth, to avoid infection." Now it's time for us to look at one of the most famous stories from the plague. One of the most well-known victims of the plague was Samuel Pepys, who wrote a diary about his experiences during the plague. Here's one entry from July 1665. "This morning I rose up early and went to my office at the Court of Admiralty, where we sat till noon, and then I took my mare and rode to Greenwich, Mer Sheffington, and I did look after a house to hire there, but could not find out anything tolerable. Thence we went to see the French ambassador's new house, which is very fine. Afterwards I did take a long walk by myself towards Lewisham, where I saw the plague had been. Thence I returned and dined with my wife at our new house in the Old Jewry, where I found her well and mending, her brother Tom and Judith going still to church, which she cannot do because of the infection. In the afternoon, Judith came to me and sat a long while with me, until something about her maid having stolen something brought us a little disagreement. She went off very angry, but presently after sent for me again and told me she was sorry and pray my pardon. And so we embraced each other, and so she went home again. After this, the fearsomeness of the plague did put a stop to my visits." To finish off this video, we're going to look at a final eyewitness account. This is from a woman named Afra Ben. "I must tell you how our town is overrun with the plague. Our streets are full of dead bodies lying about, and the stench is so strong that it makes one faint. Nobody can stay in their houses that are infected. They must leave them and run into the fields, where they lie down in ditches or under hedges and perish there. You can hardly meet with a chandler or surgeon that will go into these houses. It is so dangerous that all the physicians and surgeons are gone out of town and retired into the country. So what do you think of the Great Plague of London? Let us know in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more just like this one, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.